This story isn't easy to tell. It's messy, it's uncomfortable, and I know I've hurt people along the way. But maybe sharing it will help someone else avoid the mistakes I've made. My name is Ivory, and this is the story of how my stepsister and I crossed boundaries I never thought possible. I was 23 when Dad told me he was getting married again. His exact words were, "You'll like Carolyn, she's easygoing and she has a daughter close to your age." Like that was supposed to soften the blow. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. I just nodded and hoped this new family wouldn't mean much to me.
I was wrong. They moved in fast, bringing boxes, furniture, and a sense of permanence I wasn't ready for. That's how Johanna came into my life. She was 21, a couple of years younger than me, but way more put together. Or at least, that's how it looked on the outside.
I've never been the confident one in the room. I'm the person who blends into the background, the one people forget about 5 minutes after meeting. I guess years of feeling like I was never enough left their mark. Then Johanna shows up, and she's the opposite of me in every way. She walked in with this big, toothy grin like she owned the world. Everyone loved her instantly. My dad thought she was a breath of fresh air, and Carolyn always said she brought light into a room. Meanwhile, I felt like the dim bulb no one cared about. Sharing a space with her only made it worse. Johanna was magnetic. She had this way of making people laugh at the dumbest jokes. Her confidence wasn't loud or obnoxious. It was just there, natural. She could strike up a conversation with anyone and make them feel like they mattered. It's funny, though. For all her charm, she had cracks, too. At night, when we'd talk, because sharing a room means you end up talking whether you want to or not, she'd let her guard down a little. She told me about her mom's first marriage, how her dad left when she was a kid, how she always felt like she had to be the perfect daughter to make up for it. She didn't talk about it much, but you could tell she carried it everywhere. Even with all her confidence, Johanna wasn't as invincible as she seemed. I thought Dad and Carolyn getting married would just mean more awkward holiday dinners. I didn't think it would change the day-to-day. But then the financial problems started. Dad lost some big contract at work, Carolyn's boutique wasn't doing great, and suddenly, we were all crammed into one house, one room for me and Johanna. We were supposed to make it work. That's what Dad said. There were days when it felt impossible. Johanna was messy, always leaving her stuff everywhere. She'd talk on the phone late at night, not caring if I was trying to sleep. And I wasn't any better. I'd snap at her over little things, like her taking too long in the bathroom. It was like living with someone who was a mirror. She reflected all the things I hated about myself. And I think, in her own way, she felt the same. Dinners were the worst. We'd all sit at the table pretending to be this happy blended family. But the cracks were so obvious. Dad would ask about Johanna's classes, and Carolyn would gush about my latest project, like she was trying too hard to be supportive, and Johanna and we barely talked. We'd look down at our plates, just trying to get through the meal without saying something that would set the other off. It wasn't all bad, though. Some nights when the house was quiet and it was just the two of us in that tiny room, things felt different. We'd talk for hours about nothing and everything. Those moments were rare, but they stood out. And maybe that's where everything started to shift. I guess what I'm trying to say is, we weren't just two people stuck in the same house. We were two people carrying a lot of baggage. And somehow that baggage started to overlap in ways I didn't expect or want. At first, Johanna drove me crazy. She had this way of getting under my skin without even trying. Her clothes were always scattered across the room, her music was too loud, and she'd stay up late, laughing on the phone like we weren't sharing a wall. I thought, how am I supposed to live like this? It felt like I was being punished for something I didn't even do. But then, little by little, things changed. Not in some dramatic movie-like way, just gradually. It started with the late-night talks. I don't even remember how the first one happened. Maybe she couldn't sleep, or maybe I couldn't, but we ended up talking about stuff that actually mattered. Not just the usual small talk, but real things. One night, she brought up her ex, Weston. She said his name so casually, but you could see the weight of it. She told me how they were together for 3 years, how she thought he was the one, and then how it all fell apart. Weston cheated on her with someone she knew, a so-called friend. She tried to laugh it off, but you could hear the hurt in her voice. I didn't know what to say. I'm not good at comforting people, but I told her I understood in a way. I told her about how I always felt like the odd one out in my own family, how I could never shake the feeling of being not quite enough for anyone. Not for my dad, not for my friends, not even for myself. For some reason, she didn't laugh or brush it off. She just listened, and that made me feel seen, I guess. After that, things shifted. We weren't just two people stuck in the same room anymore. It felt like we were allies. We'd talk late into the night about everything, our dreams, our fears, the things that kept us up. Those moments were rare, but they were real, and they mattered. Of course, with the late-night talks came other things I wasn't ready to admit, even to myself, like the way her laugh would linger in the air, or how her voice softened when she let her guard down. It wasn't something I was looking for, it just happened. There was this one time, we were sitting on the floor, passing a bowl of popcorn back and forth while we watched some terrible movie on her laptop. She reached over to grab the bowl, and her hand brushed mine. It was such a small thing, barely even a moment, but I remember how my chest tightened, how I felt this strange, nervous energy that wouldn't go away. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was nothing, a weird, fleeting thought that didn't mean anything. But it kept happening. A glance that lasted a little too long. The way she'd sit close to me, her shoulder almost touching mine. Or how she'd lean in to show me something on her phone, and I could feel the warmth of her breath on my skin. It was confusing. I didn't know what to do with those feelings. I didn't even know what they were. Was it just the fact that we were forced into such close quarters? Was it some kind of twisted admiration for someone who seemed so effortlessly put together? Or was it something deeper, something I didn't want to admit? I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true, and that scared me more than anything. Before I go on, I just want to say, this story is deeply personal. Sharing it isn't easy, but I hope it speaks to someone out there. If it resonates with you, please like and subscribe to this channel. Your support means everything, especially when things get this raw. It started with a fight, not between me and Johanna, but between our parents, my dad and Carolyn. It wasn't a screaming match, but it was the kind of argument that fills a house with tension. Words thrown around like weapons, silence cutting through the spaces in between. Johanna and I just stayed in our room, listening, pretending we weren't affected. I remember how she sat on her bed, knees pulled to her chest, her face blank, but her eyes heavy, like she was holding everything in, trying not to let it show. I don't know what came over me, but I crossed the room and sat next to her. I didn't say anything at first. I just sat there, close enough that our shoulders touched. She looked at me, and for the first time that night, she smiled. Just a small, tired smile. But it was enough to break the tension. I said something dumb like, "At least they're consistent." And she laughed. Not a big laugh, just a soft chuckle, but it felt like we'd created this tiny bubble where everything outside didn't matter, just the two of us. Then, the room got quiet. Not awkward, just still. She was looking at me, and it wasn't just a glance. It was a look that held. I don't even know how to describe it. It was like she saw me, not the person I tried to be, but the one I was afraid to show. And in that moment, it felt like I saw her too. I don't know who leaned in first, Maybe it was her, maybe it was me, maybe it was both of us at the same time. All I know is that 1 second we were sitting there, and the next, our lips were touching. It wasn't some grand, passionate moment. It was hesitant, slow, like we were both trying to figure out if this was real. But then, something shifted. The hesitation melted away, and it became something else, something deeper. I remember how her hand rested on my arm, the way her fingers curled slightly, like she was anchoring herself. I remember the warmth of her breath, the way it made my skin tingle. And I remember thinking, this is wrong. But at the same time, it didn't feel wrong. It felt inevitable. When the kiss ended, we didn't pull away completely. Our foreheads rested against each other, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. The air felt thick, charged. My mind was racing, but I couldn't form a single coherent thought. All I could feel was her, the way her presence seemed to fill the room, the way my chest tightened every time her fingers brushed against mine. I wanted to say something, to stop it, to make sense of what was happening. But then she whispered, "It's okay." Just 2 words, barely audible, but they broke whatever was holding me back. And before I could think, we were kissing again. This time there was no hesitation, just need, just us. Even as it was happening, part of me was screaming to stop, to pull away, to remind myself who we were, what this meant. But that part of me was small, drowned out by something bigger, something I didn't want to admit but couldn't deny. I told myself it was just the heat of the moment, that it wouldn't go further, that we'd stop before we crossed a line. But we didn't stop. And as much as I want to say I regret it, in that moment I didn't. When it was over, we just sat there, the silence almost deafening. She looked at me, her face a mix of emotions I couldn't read, and I felt everything. Guilt, fear, relief, like I'd been holding my breath for years, and I finally let it out. But along with that came the weight of what we'd done, the realization that nothing would ever be the same. We didn't talk about it that night. We didn't know how. We just existed in that moment, caught between what we were and what we'd become. I know what you're thinking. I know how this sounds. And trust me, I've thought about it every day since. I've replayed that night over and over, trying to understand how we let it happen. And the truth is, I don't have an answer. All I know is that it did, and it changed everything. There was a family gathering that night. It was one of those obligatory events. Food on the table, laughter that didn't quite reach the eyes. I spent most of it on autopilot, nodding along to conversations I wasn't really listening to. Johanna was quieter than usual, keeping to herself, and I caught myself watching her more than I should have. Every time our eyes met, she looked away, but there was something in her expression, something I couldn't ignore. After the guests left, the house felt too quiet. My dad and Carolyn went to bed early, probably exhausted from playing the perfect hosts. That left me and Johanna in our room. The air was heavy, like we were both waiting for something but didn't know what. There was a storm outside, loud with thunder rolling in the distance. Then the power went out. Just like that, the room was pitch black except for the occasional flash of lightning through the window. I lit a candle, and for some reason, that tiny flame made everything feel closer, more intimate. She sat on the floor, leaning against her bed, and I joined her. We didn't say much at first, just sat there, listening to the rain. But then she spoke, softly, almost like she didn't want me to hear. She said, "It's been a lot lately, hasn't it?" I nodded, not trusting myself to say anything, and she continued. "I don't know what I'd do without you here." Her voice cracked, just a little, and that's when I looked at her. It was like the world outside disappeared. It wasn't about the storm or the dark or the silence anymore. It was just her, The way her hair fell over her face. The way her eyes searched mine like she was trying to figure something out. I don't know who leaned in first. Maybe it was me. Maybe it was her. But when our lips met, it felt like the world stopped spinning. It wasn't rushed or frantic. It was slow, almost cautious, like we were testing the waters. Her hands found mine, her fingers curling around mine in a way that felt both comforting and terrifying. The warmth of her touch, the softness of her lips. It was overwhelming, and yet it felt right. For a moment, it felt like all the noise in my head disappeared. There was just her, just us. When it was over, we didn't say anything. We just sat there side by side, the candlelight flickering between us. My heart was racing, and my mind was screaming at me, telling me this was wrong, that we'd crossed a line we couldn't uncross. But there was another part of me, a quieter part that didn't care, that wanted to stay in that moment forever. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I replayed it over and over. The way she looked at me, the way she touched me, the way it felt so easy and so impossible all at once. By the time morning came, the guilt had settled in like a weight on my chest. Johanna barely looked at me the next morning. She was distant, polite in that way people are when they're trying to pretend nothing happened. It was like she'd put up this wall overnight, and I couldn't figure out how to break through it. Every time our parents spoke to us, I felt like they knew, even though I knew that was impossible. The tension was unbearable. I wanted to talk to her, to ask her what she was feeling, but I didn't know how, and maybe I was scared of what she'd say, scared that she'd regret it, scared that she wouldn't. That was the night everything changed. The night I realized that sometimes the things we want most are the things we're least prepared for. And once you cross a line like that, there's no going back. Not really. It didn't take long for things to feel off. I don't know if it was just in my head or if everyone could tell, but the air in the house changed. My dad, Roger, started asking more questions, like why I was so quiet at dinner or why Johanna seemed distracted. Carolyn wasn't as direct, but she had this way of looking at me, like she was trying to figure out what I wasn't saying. And Johanna? She avoided me unless we were forced to be in the same room. I thought the worst part would be the silence between us. But then she started seeing someone, Forrest Russo. He was one of those guys who always had a perfect smile, always knew the right thing to say. Everyone loved him, and Carolyn couldn't stop talking about how great he was for Johanna. And maybe he was. But watching them together, it felt like I was being ripped apart from the inside. She'd bring him around the house, and I'd have to sit there, pretending I didn't care. Pretending I wasn't watching the way she laughed at his jokes or the way he'd put his arm around her like he belonged there. I couldn't say anything, couldn't show anything, and that made it worse. Every time I saw them together, it felt like a reminder of everything I couldn't have. But the worst moment? That came one evening, when we got too careless. I don't know why we thought it was a good idea. Maybe it was the stress, or maybe we were just tired of pretending. Johanna and I ended up in the kitchen late at night. Everyone else was asleep, and it felt safe. Like we could steal this one moment without the rest of the world crashing in. I don't even remember what started it. We were talking about something small, something meaningless, and then she touched my arm. It was so subtle, so quick, but it was like everything we'd been holding back came flooding to the surface. Before I knew it, we were standing too close, her hand resting on my shoulder, and my heart pounding so loud I thought it might wake the whole house. That's when it happened. Promise Patel, my dad's cousin, walked in. She'd been staying with us for the week, and I guess she came down for water or something. She didn't say anything, just stood there for a second, staring. We weren't doing anything, not really, but it was enough to make her pause. Enough to make me feel like everything was about to come crashing down. I pulled away from Johanna so fast, I almost knocked over the chair behind me. Promise just looked at us, her eyebrows raised, and then she said something like, "Don't stay up too late." She walked out like nothing happened, but the way she looked at me before she turned, I knew she saw something. Maybe she didn't know exactly what, but she saw enough. After that, I couldn't sleep. Every little sound in the house made my chest tighten. I kept waiting for someone to confront me, for Promise to say something to my dad or Carolyn. But she didn't. At least not right away. And that almost made it worse. The waiting. The not knowing. I started avoiding everyone, meals, conversations, even Johanna. I couldn't look her in the eye without feeling like I was about to fall apart. And the worst part? She acted like nothing had happened. Like that night in the kitchen never existed. Like we hadn't just risked everything. It was like being trapped in my own head, replaying every moment, every word, every touch over and over again. I kept asking myself the same questions. How long can we keep this up? What happens if someone finds out? What happens to us? And the answer was always the same. I didn't know. And that scared me more than anything. It all came to a head one night, not long after the incident with Promise. Johanna came into the room late, her face pale and her movements stiff. I could tell something was wrong the second I saw her. She sat on her bed, barely looking at me, and for a while there was only silence. I wanted to say something, but the words felt stuck in my throat. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but firm. She said, "We can't keep doing this, Ivory." Just like that. No build-up, no explanation. I tried to respond, but she kept going. "It's not right. It's not fair. To them, to us, to anyone." Her voice cracked on that last word, and I could see the tears in her eyes. It was like she'd been holding it in for so long, and now it was spilling out all at once. I tried to tell her that we'd figure it out, that we didn't have to stop. But she shook her head, cutting me off. "Ivory, I can't," she said. "I can't keep looking at Carolyn knowing what I've done. I can't keep pretending like this isn't going to destroy everything." And that's when it hit me. Really hit me. She wasn't just scared. She was breaking, and I'd helped push her there. Watching her pull away from me was one of the hardest things I've ever had to endure. I wanted to hold her, to tell her that we could fix it somehow, but I knew she was right. We'd made a mess of everything, and there was no easy way to fix it. She told me she needed space, that we both did. And as much as it hurt, I couldn't argue. When she left the room that night, it felt final, like she'd taken a piece of me with her. I sat there for hours, staring at the empty bed across from mine, trying to figure out how we'd gotten here, how something that felt so right in the moment could turn into something so wrong. I knew I couldn't stay. Not after that. The walls of the house felt like they were closing in, and every glance from my dad or Carolyn felt like they were on the verge of discovering the truth. So, I made a decision. I reached out to Julian Vila, an old friend who'd offered me a job in the city months ago. At the time, I'd turned it down. But now it felt like the only way out. Moving out was harder than I thought it would be. Saying goodbye to my dad and Carolyn, pretending like everything was fine, it was exhausting. But the hardest part was leaving Johanna. She barely said anything when I told her I was leaving, just nodded and said, "It's for the best." I wanted her to fight for me, to tell me to stay, but she didn't. And that was the closure I didn't want, but knew I needed. Being in the city helped. The distance gave me space to think, to really process everything that had happened. I'd lost Johanna, not just as a stepsister, but as someone I loved in a way I couldn't explain, even to myself. And that loss stayed with me. Still stays with me, if I'm being honest. I've thought about reaching out to her 100 times. A text, a call, something. But I haven't. Maybe it's because I'm afraid of what she'll say. Or maybe it's because I know that some things are better left in the past. Either way, we haven't spoken since I left. And maybe that's for the best, too. And I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive myself for what happened, but I've learned a lot about boundaries, respect, and the weight of my actions. What Johanna and I did wasn't just a mistake, it was a choice. And choices have consequences. I carry those with me every day. Johanna and I don't talk much anymore, but I hope she's found happiness. I really do. As for me, I'm still figuring things out, one day at a time. And maybe that's all we can do. If you've made it this far, thank you. Thank you for listening, for letting me share this with you. If this story has meant something to you, please consider subscribing. It means more than you know. Take care of yourselves and of the people you love. If you've ever been in a situation like this, know that you're not alone. Life is complicated, relationships are messy, and we all make mistakes. What matters is what we take away from those moments, how we grow, how we move forward. I'm not proud of everything I've done, but I'm trying to learn from it. That's all any of us can do. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever faced something you didn't think you could get through? I'd love to hear your stories too. We're all human, and sometimes just sharing can help more than you think. If you've made it this far, thank you. Thank you for listening, for letting me share this with you. If this story has meant something to you, please don't forget to subscribe. It means more than you know. Take care of yourselves and of the people you love.